The first time Karen smiled while my parents packed their belongings, I thought she was simply being cruel. I was wrong. She wasn't smiling because my parents were leaving. She was smiling because she believed she had finally won. What Karen didn't know was that the moving truck sitting in my parents' driveway wasn't taking them away from our ranch. It was taking them somewhere Karen never expected. Straight into the house she had spent the last year trying to control. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 43 years old and I've lived on the same piece of Texas land for most of my life. My parents, Robert and Linda Carter, were getting older. They had spent nearly 40 years in the small farmhouse at the back of our property, while I lived in the main ranch house about 300 yards away. Between us stood an old wooden fence, a red barn, 2 cattle pastures, and a gravel road that curved toward the county highway. It had always been peaceful, until Karen Whitmore became president of our HOA. Our neighborhood was called Cedar Ridge Estates, although "states" was a generous word for a place where half the homes sat beside cattle fields and everyone knew which neighbor owned which tractor. The HOA had been created years before I bought my property, and for years, it had mostly been harmless annual meetings, a few letters about weed-ins, occasional complaints about trailers being parked too close to roads, nothing worth losing sleep over. Then Karen took over. She was 51, tall and slender, with perfectly styled shoulder-length blonde hair, sharp green eyes, and a smile that never quite reached her face. She drove a black 2023 Cadillac Escalade and dressed like she was permanently prepared for a television interview. Cream blouses, tailored jackets, dark slacks, and expensive ankle boots. Karen didn't just want to run the HOA, she wanted everyone to know she ran it. And for some reason, my ranch became her favorite target. It started with a fence. One Tuesday morning, I found a bright orange violation notice stapled to the wooden post beside my driveway. "Uno si residis ter usi tuori." I stared at it for nearly a minute. The structure in question was a fence I'd repaired myself. The same fence had been there for 27 years. I called the OA office. Karen answered. "Daniel," she said pleasantly. "I was wondering when you'd call. You cited my fence." "Yes! It's been there since before the OA existed." There was a pause. "That doesn't necessarily make it compliant." I looked through the kitchen window at my father, who was sitting at the table drinking coffee. "Compliant with what? Our updated architectural standards? Updated when?" Last month I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Karen told me I had 30 days to remove the fence or pay a $250 daily fine. I asked her to send me the rule. She said she would. She never did. Instead, 3 days later, another notice appeared. This one was for my red barn, then one for my cattle gate, then one claiming my gravel driveway violated community appearance standards. It became obvious that this wasn't about the rules. It was about control. And then Karen made her biggest mistake. She targeted my parents. My father was 71. My mother was 68. They had spent decades working that land. My father had built the original fence with his own hands. My mother had planted the oak trees beside their farmhouse. Neither of them had any interest in HOA politics. But Karen didn't care. She sent them a letter claiming their farmhouse was incompatible with current neighborhood aesthetics. My mother called me that night. Her voice sounded different. "Daniel, honey, what does that mean? It means Karen is trying to scare you? Can she make us leave?" "No," I said it confidently. But the truth was I wasn't completely sure. That night, I opened every document I had. Property deeds, survey maps, HOA bylaws, county records, old tax documents. And that's when I found something strange. My parents' farmhouse wasn't technically inside the OA-controlled section of our property. Neither was part of the land surrounding it. The original developer had drawn the HOA boundary around the newer lots. My family's property had existed before the subdivision. That meant Karen had been issuing violations against property the HOA might not even have authority over. I printed everything. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. A woman named Susan Miller pulled the original subdivision plat. She studied it for several minutes. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Carter, who told you the HOA controlled this parcel?" "Karen Whitmore." Susan raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's interesting." She pointed to a faded line on the old map. "Your parents' farmhouse isn't inside the HOA boundary." My stomach tightened. "So they can't find them. Not based on these documents." I took pictures of every page, but before I left, Susan said something that stopped me at the door. "There's something else." She pulled out another document, an old access agreement. My father's name was on it. So was the developer's. The agreement had been recorded 29 years earlier. It granted my family permanent access to the private road running through the neighborhood. And there was a second clause. The HOA could not block, restrict, or revoke access to the Carter property. I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, I thought Karen had finally pushed too far. I drove home. I thought I had the proof I needed. But Karen already knew something I didn't. That evening, she showed up at my ranch. The black Escalade rolled slowly down my gravel driveway and stopped beside the wooden fence. Karen stepped out wearing a cream blazer, black pants, and polished ankle boots. She looked at the barn, then the pasture, then the farmhouse in the distance. "Beautiful property," she said. "What do you want?" She smiled. "I'm here to make you an offer." I almost laughed. "On what?" "Your parents' farmhouse." I stared at her. "My parents aren't selling." "Everyone has a price, not them." Karen folded her arms. "You should think carefully." "Why?" "Because this neighborhood is changing." She glanced toward the newer houses. People don't want to live next to livestock. They bought houses next to a ranch. That's not how everyone sees it. I stepped closer. "Are you threatening my parents?" "No." Her smile disappeared. I'm warning you." She got back into her Escalade and drove away. 3 days later, my parents received another violation, then another, then a notice demanding they remove their farmhouse's front porch. That was the moment I hired an attorney. His name was Michael Reynolds. He was 47, calm, broad-shouldered, with short dark hair and rectangular glasses. He spent almost 2 hours reading through the documents. Finally, he leaned back. "Daniel, your OA has a problem." "What kind?" "A big one." He tapped the access agreement. "This document predates the CHOA by several years. So Karen can't simply pretend it doesn't exist. Then why is she doing this?" Michael looked at me. "Because she thinks nobody will challenge her." I didn't realize how right he was. At the next HOA meeting, I walked into the clubhouse carrying a folder containing every document I'd found. Karen was already sitting at the front table. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled. Her green eyes scanned the room. Nearly 30 homeowners had shown up. Karen tapped the microphone. "Let's begin." I stood. Her smile tightened. "Of course." "Daniel, why is the HOA issuing violations against property outside the HOA boundary?" The room went silent. Karen stared at me, then she laughed, not nervously, confidently. "Daniel, I think you've misunderstood the documents. I placed the county plat on the table." "Have I?" Her face changed only for a second, but I saw it. Fear. Then she recovered. "The HOA has authority over all properties using the community road." I pulled out the access agreement. "Actually, this says the opposite." A murmur moved through the room. Karen's board members leaned toward each other. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear. Karen looked at me. "You hired an attorney?" "Wes," she smiled. "Then I suppose we'll be seeing each other in court." I nodded. "If that's what it takes." I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't even close. 2 mornings later, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery. I stepped outside. A county excavator was parked near the entrance to our private road. Workers were unloading steel barriers, and standing beside them was Karen. "What are you doing?" She turned. "Improving security. Be putting barriers on my road. Community property." I held up the access agreement. "My parents have permanent access." Karen smiled. "Your parents?" She looked toward the farmhouse. "Daniel, they're moving soon anyway." I froze. "What did you just say?" Karen's expression remained calm. I said, "They're moving." "They're not moving." She smiled. "Not yet." Then she got into her Escalade. As she drove away, I noticed something I'd never seen before. A small white sign had been installed beside the road. "Pruamiate says no, umendaraydantiarwa," and beneath it was the Achua logo. I called Michael immediately. He told me not to confront anyone. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Daniel, I think Karen may be trying to force your parents off the property." "Why?" "Because if she can make them leave voluntarily, she can change the situation without fighting the deed." I looked toward the farmhouse. My parents were standing on the porch. My mother was holding a cardboard box. My father was carrying an old wooden picture frame. They looked exhausted. I walked over. "What's going on?" Mom looked at Dad. Dad looked at me. Then he sighed. "We've decided to move." I felt like the ground disappeared beneath my feet. "What?" "We're getting too old for the farmhouse," Mom said softly. "Who convinced you?" Neither answered. I looked at my father. "Did Karen threaten you?" He shook his head. "No." "Then why?" Dad looked toward the barn. "Because we're tired, son." Those words hurt more than any AOA letter ever had. My parents had spent their entire lives fighting for that property, and now they were ready to give it up. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, a moving truck arrived. Karen saw it. She came walking down the road with that familiar smile. She stood near the fence and watched my parents carry boxes outside. Then she laughed softly. "Looks like I was right." I stepped outside. Karen looked at me. "Your parents are finally leaving." I stared at her. Then I said the sentence that wiped the smile from her face. "New." She frowned. "What?" I pointed toward the farmhouse. "They're not leaving the ranch." Karen's expression changed. I looked directly into her green eyes. "They're moving into your house." And for the first time since Karen Whitmore became president of our OA, she had absolutely nothing to say. Karen stared at me as if I had just spoken another language. For several seconds, she didn't move. Then she gave a nervous little laugh. "My house." "That's what I said." She glanced toward the farmhouse, then back at me. "Daniel, I think you finally lost your mind." I didn't answer. Because I knew something Karen didn't. The previous afternoon, Michael Reynolds had called me after reviewing the county records again. He had found a second document, one that changed everything. The property Karen lived in wasn't owned by her. Not entirely. Her home sat on a parcel that had originally been divided from a much larger tract, and when the subdivision was created, the developer had placed a restrictive covenant on that parcel. Karen had violated it several times. The problem was that nobody had ever enforced it, until now. But there was something even more important. My parents had been searching for a smaller home because the farmhouse had become difficult for them to maintain. They didn't want to leave the ranch. They simply wanted a house with fewer stairs, less maintenance, and easier access. And Karen's house happened to be perfect. It was a single-story property on a corner lot, only a few minutes from my ranch. But there was one complication. Karen didn't want to sell. So my parents made an offer anyway, and Karen's husband, Mark, had accepted it, without telling her. I watched Karen's face as she processed what I'd said. "You're not. My house isn't for sale."
It was, as she stared at me.
"Who told you that?" I smiled. "Your husband." Her face went pale. "Mark." I nodded. Karen immediately pulled out her phone. She called him. He answered. I couldn't hear what he said, but I could see the expression on Karen's face change with every second. "What do you mean you signed?" She listened. Then her voice rose. "You can't sell the house without telling me." She turned away from me. I walked back toward the farmhouse. Behind me, I heard Karen shouting into the phone. For the first time, she wasn't in control, and I knew that feeling was going to become very familiar to her. My parents' moving truck left the farmhouse around noon, but instead of heading toward the highway, it turned down Cedar Ridge Road. Karen's house was at the end of the street. I followed in my pickup. My parents sat in the moving truck. My mother was nervous. My father looked relieved. When we arrived, Karen's Escalade was already parked across the driveway. She had apparently driven home as fast as possible. She stood in front of the garage. "Nobody is moving into my house." My father stepped out of the truck. "Actually, Karen, we closed yesterday." She stared at him. Whoa, Dad held up a folder. Deed is recorded. Karen looked at me. I didn't say anything. She looked back at my father. "You can't do this?" Dad smiled. "Apparently, I can." That was the first time I'd seen my father smile in weeks. But Karen wasn't finished. She stepped toward him. "You're trespassing." My father stopped. "This is my property now." "No, it isn't." Mom stepped out of the truck. "Linda," Dad said quietly, "don't argue." Mom looked at Karen. "We aren't here to fight." Karen laughed bitterly. "You people think you can just take my house." My mother shook her head. "No, your husband sold it." Karen's face tightened. Then she pointed toward the moving truck. "Get those things off my property." Dad calmly opened the folder. "Karen, this property transferred ownership yesterday at 40:60 p.m. She stared at the papers. I could see her hands trembling. Then she said something that made me realize she still believed she had one final weapon. "I'm the FOA president." Dad looked at her.
"So I can prevent this." "No," I said. "You can't."
Karen turned toward me. "Watch me." She called the HOA attorney. Then she called the sheriff's office. Then she called 3 board members. Within 30 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. Karen walked toward them like she was welcoming old friends. "Officer, they're trespassing." The older deputy asked, "Who owns the property?" Karen pointed at my parents. "They're trespassing." The deputy looked at Dad. "Do you have identification?" Dad handed him his driver's license. Then the closing documents. The deputy studied them. Then he looked at Karen. "Mom, the documents indicate Mr. Carter and Mrs. Carter are the current owners." Karen's jaw dropped. "But I live here." The deputy shrugged. "That doesn't change ownership." Karen stepped closer. "Officer, I'm the HOA president." The deputy looked completely unimpressed. "I'm aware. Then you understand I have authority over the HOA," he said. "Not over property ownership." Karen went silent. The second deputy almost smiled. Karen turned toward me. "This isn't over." I nodded. "I know," as she walked away. But before she reached her Escalade, she turned around. "Daniel, you're going to regret this." My father answered before I could. "No, Karen." She looked at him. "I think you're the one who's going to regret it." She drove away. My parents moved into their new home that afternoon. For the first time in months, they looked happy. Mom opened the curtains. Dad stood in the backyard. He looked at the small patio and laughed. "It's tiny? It's perfect?" Mom said. I watched them unpack. Then I noticed something strange. There was an old wooden box sitting inside one of the moving containers. It belonged to my grandfather. Dad hadn't opened it in decades. That evening, he called me into the garage. "I think it's time you saw this." He opened the box. Inside were old property documents, photographs, handwritten letters, and a leather-bound notebook. I picked up the notebook. "What's this?" "Your grandfather's." I opened it. The first pages were notes about the ranch. Then I found something that made my heart stop. A hand-drawn property map. It showed the original Carter Ranch before Cedar Ridge Estates existed. The map included the road, the farmhouse, the barn, and a small section where Karen's house now stood. Dad pointed at it. "Your grandfather sold that piece of land to the developer. Karen's house." "Wes." I turned the page. There was another note. It said the developer had promised the Carter family permanent access through the subdivision. I looked at Dad. "We already knew that." He shook his head. "Not all of it." He pointed to a paragraph written in faded ink. The original agreement required the subdivision's future OA to maintain a public access corridor connecting the Carter Ranch to the county road. It wasn't merely an easement. It was a recorded condition of development. And there was a clause I had never seen. If the HOA attempted to block access, the restriction could be enforced against the HOA board members individually. I stared at the page. "Does Karen know about this?" Dad smiled. "I don't think anyone does." The next morning, Michael came to the ranch. I showed him the notebook. He read the pages carefully. Then he called the county recorder. 2 hours later, he returned. "Daniel." "What?" "This is real." My stomach tightened. "What does it mean?" "It means Karen's road project may have been illegal from the beginning." I looked toward the gravel road. The steel barriers were still sitting beside it. "Can we remove them?" "Not yet." "Why?" "Because we need the county to confirm the original conditions." That afternoon, a county surveyor arrived. His name was Thomas Reed. He was 56, tall, gray-haired, and carried a weathered leather survey case. He spent nearly 4 hours walking the property. He checked old markers. He compared the original plat with the current county records. Then he drove toward the subdivision entrance. I followed. The steel barriers Karen had installed were blocking the road. Thomas looked at them. "These weren't here when I surveyed this area?" "Karen put them in." "Did she get a county permit?" "Not that I know of." He took photographs. Then he called the county office. 30 minutes later, a county inspector arrived. He looked at the barriers, then at the HOA sign. "Who authorized this?" I told him. He frowned. "Karen Whitmore." "Yes," he sighed. "She may have a problem." The county ordered the AOA to remove the barriers within 48 hours. Karen wasn't there when they arrived, but she showed up later that evening. She was furious. She stormed onto the ranch. "You went behind my back." I was standing beside the fence. "I went to the county. You humiliated me, Karen." I looked at her. "You did that yourself." She pointed at me. "You think this is about your parents?"
It is.
"No." She stepped closer. "This is about control of this neighbor who." I stared at her. "You just admitted it." She froze. Then she turned around and walked away. But Karen had one final move. The next morning I received a letter from her attorney. It claimed my parents' purchase of her house was part of a scheme to destabilize the HOA. They demanded the sale be reversed. Michael read the letter. Then he laughed. "That's ridiculous."
Can they stop the sale?
"They can try," and they did. 3 days later, Karen's attorney filed a civil lawsuit against my parents. The claim alleged that Karen had been pressured into selling the property. It also accused me of manipulating the transaction. My mother was devastated. She sat at the kitchen table holding the lawsuit. "We don't want trouble." I sat beside her. "You didn't cause this. I just wanted a quiet house." "I know." My father put his hand over hers. "Then we'll fight." That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight Karen with anger. I was going to fight her with records. Every letter. Every violation, Efren. Every photograph. Every county document. Every meeting recording. Everything went into one massive binder. Michael called it the Karen file. Then he found something else. An HOA financial record. It showed that Karen had authorized nearly $18,000 in legal expenses against my family, without a board vote, without proper authorization. And some of the money had gone to a private consulting company owned by Karen's brother. I stared at the document. "Is this legal?" Michael removed his glasses. "Not if the records are accurate." "Then what?" "Then Karen has a much bigger problem than your parents moving into her house." The next HOA meeting was packed. More than 70 homeowners showed up. Karen walked into the clubhouse with her attorney. She looked confident. Until she saw the projector. I had placed the financial records on the screen. The room went silent. Karen's attorney whispered something. Karen stared at me. "You can't display confidential records." I held up the OA's own disclosure policy. "They're public to the homeowners." Someone in the back shouted, "Where did the $18,000 go?" Another homeowner stood. "Why did we pay your brother?" Karen slammed her hand on the table. "Nuff!" The room erupted. For the first time, the neighbors weren't afraid of her. They were angry. Then the clubhouse doors opened. 3 county officials walked inside. Behind them was Sheriff James Walker. Karen's face went white. Sheriff Walker approached the table. "Karen Whitmore." She swallowed. "Yes, we need to speak with you." "About what?" He handed her a document. "Financial records." She looked at the paper, then at me. Her eyes were full of hatred. But underneath that hatred was something else. Fear. And as Sheriff Walker escorted her outside, I realized something. Karen's fight against my parents had never really been about a farmhouse. It had never been about a fence. It had never even been about the HOA. She had been trying to force my family out because she wanted control of the land around us. And now I had to find out exactly why. Because buried somewhere in those county records was the answer. And when Michael found it, even he told me to sit down before he showed me. Michael didn't say anything for almost a minute. He sat across from me in his office with the county records spread across his desk. Then he turned one document toward me. "Look at the highlighted section." I leaned forward. It was an old development agreement dated 29 years earlier. The developer had purchased hundreds of acres surrounding our ranch. But there was a condition attached to the purchase. The developer could only build Cedar Ridge estates if a specific portion of the original Carter land remained protected as agricultural property. My ranch. I looked at Michael. "Sir." He pointed to another page. "Karen's brother's company bought the development rights to several parcels around your ranch 6 months ago." I felt my stomach tighten. "Why?" "Because they're planning to expand the subdivision." I stared at the map. The proposed expansion covered the pasture where my cattle grazed, and the road leading to my parents' old farmhouse. Michael continued. "Your family owns the last undeveloped tract that blocks their expansion." So Karen wanted us gone." "Exactly." Suddenly everything made sense. The fence violations, the pressure on my parents, the road barriers, the strange offer for the farmhouse. Karen hadn't been trying to enforce HOA rules. She had been trying to make my family abandon property that was worth millions to a developer. And there was more. Karen's brother's company had already submitted preliminary plans to the county. They needed my land. Without it, the expansion couldn't connect to the main road. I leaned back. "How much?" Michael looked at me. "The proposed development could be worth more than $20 million. I laughed bitterly. $20 million. At least. And Karen thought she could scare us into selling. She almost did. That sentence stayed with me. Because he was right. My parents had nearly surrendered. Not because Karen had legal authority. Because she had made them believe they were powerless. The next morning, Sheriff James Walker called. He asked me to come to the county administration building. When I arrived, Karen was already there. She looked completely different. Her blonde hair was still perfectly styled, but her confidence was gone. Her attorney sat beside her. Across the room were 2 county officials, Thomas Reed the surveyor, and an investigator from the County Financial Crimes Division. Sheriff Walker closed the door. "Mr. Carter, we've reviewed the OA financial records." I nodded. He continued. "We believe there may have been unauthorized payments and a conflict of interest involving Mrs. Whitmore." Karen's attorney immediately objected. "Those are allegations." Sheriff Walker nodded. "Correct?" Then Thomas Reed placed a map on the table. This is more concerning. He pointed to the road. Karen's company submitted construction plans that require access across the Carter agricultural corridor. I stared at him. Can they do that? No. Thomas pointed to the original development agreement. This corridor is protected. Karen finally spoke. That's an old document. Thomas looked at her. That's why we checked it. He placed another document beside it. It was reaffirmed in the county record 7 years ago. Karen's face went pale. Her attorney leaned toward her. She whispered something. Then Karen looked at me. I didn't know. You found all this and never told me. I almost laughed. Why would I warn you? She looked down. For once she had no answer. The county ordered the HOA to immediately stop enforcement actions against my family. They also ordered the removal of the barriers from the road. But the biggest blow came 3 days later. A judge issued a temporary injunction preventing the HOA and Karen's brother's company from interfering with my family's property rights. The lawsuit against my parents was dismissed. Karen's attorney withdrew from the case shortly afterward. Then the homeowners demanded an emergency OA election. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. The result was overwhelming. Karen was removed as president. Her entire board lost control. And when the new board opened the financial records, they discovered even more unauthorized payments. Karen had spent thousands of dollars pursuing violations against properties she knew were outside HOA jurisdiction. She had paid consultants connected to her family, and she had attempted to use HOA resources to pressure my parents into selling. But the most satisfying moment came 2 weeks later. My parents stood in front of their new house. The same house Karen had once called hers. Mom had planted flowers along the front walkway. Dad had built a small wooden bench beneath the window. The house wasn't large, it didn't have a huge yard, it didn't have a barn or cattle pasture. But my parents loved it, and they were finally sleeping peacefully. One afternoon, I found Dad sitting on the bench. He looked toward the ranch in the distance. You know, he said, I thought moving meant losing everything. I sat beside him. Did you? He smiled. No. He looked at the house. I think we gained something. What? Peace. I didn't answer, because he was right. The ranch was still ours. The road was still protected. The farmhouse remained part of our family history, and Karen's plan had collapsed. But there was one final surprise. 6 months later, the county approved a conservation agreement protecting the Carter agricultural tract from future subdivision development. The red barn stayed, the wooden fence stayed, the cattle pasture stayed, and the gravel road remained exactly where my grandfather had built it. As for Karen, she moved out of Cedar Ridge Estates. I heard she bought a condo nearly 40 miles away. Ironically, the new HOA there had much stricter rules. My mother laughed when she heard. Maybe she'll finally understand how it feels. I smiled. Maybe? But I never celebrated Karen's downfall. Because by then, I'd learned something more important. The real victory wasn't making Karen lose. It was making sure my parents never again felt like they had to surrender their home because someone with a title told them they didn't belong. 1 year after everything happened, the HOA held its annual meeting. The new president stood at the microphone. He announced that the board had officially removed several illegal restrictions that had been created under Karen's administration. Then he read a statement recognizing the Carter family's original property rights. When the meeting ended, several neighbors came over. One older man shook my hand. I'm sorry we didn't stand up sooner. I told him it was okay. Another neighbor said, Karen had everyone scared. I looked around the clubhouse. That's how people like her stay powerful. My father was waiting outside. He had his old brown cowboy hat on. His hands were weathered. His boots were dusty. He looked toward the road. Ready to go home. I smiled. Yeah, we drove back to the ranch together. The sun was setting behind the red barn. The cattle were moving slowly across the pasture. The wooden fence cast long shadows across the grass. For the first time in a long time, everything felt quiet. My father stopped near the gate. He looked at the property. This land has survived a lot. I nodded. He took off his hat. Then he said something I'll never forget. Never let someone convince you that owning your home means you have to surrender your dignity. I looked across the ranch. At the barn. The fence. The farmhouse where my parents had spent most of their lives. And the road Karen had once tried to block. She thought she was forcing my parents out. She thought that HOA gave her power over us. She thought she could take our land without ever touching a deed. But she made one mistake. She confused authority with ownership, and she confused fear with surrender. My parents didn't lose their home that year. They found a better one. Karen didn't lose because we fought harder. She lost because eventually, the truth became impossible to hide. And every time I drive past that old HOA entrance, I remember the morning Karen stood there smiling while my parents packed. She thought she was watching us leave. She had no idea she was watching the beginning of the end of her entire plan. Because sometimes the most powerful answer to someone trying to take your home isn't to fight them harder. It's to stand your ground long enough for the truth to take their power away.